Hello, everyone, and welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're taking a pretty fascinating journey. We're going to start way up high in the cognitive clouds, looking at the deep brain theories of how we actually acquire language, and then we're going to drop straight down into the trenches, into the very real, often super stressful reality of the graduate educators who are supposed to teach it. We often think that wrapping our heads around complex learning theories is the final hurdle in language education. But as we'll see today, untangling the cognitive science, that's really only half the battle. The actual struggle usually belongs to the teachers themselves, who are finding themselves caught in this massive, growing gap between high-level academic research and their everyday, boots-on-the-ground classroom reality.
Okay, let's dive right into this by starting with a frustration I think we can all relate to. Have you ever spent weeks, maybe even months studying a language, completely aced a written grammar test, and then just froze up the second a native speaker asked you a basic question? It's literally the worst, right? But why does that happen? Why is it so incredibly common to have all the rules perfectly organized in our head, but totally fail to actually speak? Well, this disconnect sits right at the heart of one of the absolute biggest debates in second language acquisition, and it perfectly sets the stage for everything we're getting into today.
So here is our roadmap for the explainer today. 1. Implicit v. explicit knowledge. 2. The interface debate. 3. The teacher's dilemma. 4. Statistical anxiety and barriers. And finally 5. Bridging theory and practice. Let's get moving.
Section 1. Implicit versus explicit knowledge.
So, to understand why we freeze up, we have to look at this massive cognitive divide in how our brains actually store language. It's basically a tale of two systems. On one side, we have what's called implicit knowledge. This is your unconscious, completely intuitive grasp of a language. It's what's firing when you're speaking fluently and spontaneously, usually picked up just through meaningful exposure, like chatting with friends or getting lost in a good book. You know a sentence sounds right, even if you couldn't tell me why. Then, on the flip side, we have explicit knowledge. This one is entirely conscious and rule-based. It's exactly what you get from formal classroom instruction, like memorizing from a textbook that a third-person singular verb in English needs an S at the end. You can recite the rule perfectly, but, as we were just talking about, you might still totally drop that S when you're talking fast.
For the longest time, trying to scientifically measure the difference between these two types of knowledge was a total headache for researchers. But then, linguist Rod Ellis came along. He developed a very specific battery of 5 psychometric tests to lock this down. To check for that spontaneous, implicit knowledge, he used an imitation test and an oral narrative test. Then he threw in a timed grammaticality judgment test. That one forces learners to react under pressure, basically bypassing the conscious brain to tap straight into their gut instinct. But to measure the explicit stuff, he took the clock away with an untimed grammaticality judgment test and finally added a metalinguistic knowledge test, where learners quite literally had to sit down and explain the grammar rules. By doing this, Ellis essentially proved scientifically that our implicit and explicit language skills actually operate as completely distinct cognitive systems.
Section 2. The interface debate.
Now that we know these two systems are distinct, it sparks a huge academic battleground. How do these two types of knowledge actually interact up in our brains? And this brilliantly illustrates what linguists call the interface debate, which basically splits into 3 camps. First up, the strong interface position. This camp argues that if you just practice explicit rules enough, they will eventually morph into automatic implicit knowledge. Think of it kind of like learning to drive a manual car. At first, you're overthinking every single clutch movement, but eventually your body just takes over. Next, we have the no interface position, famously backed by Stephen Krushen. This one is radical. It argues these systems never cross over. Studying grammar rules will literally never turn into implicit fluency. For this camp, only natural exposure builds true fluency. And finally, sitting right in the middle, we have the weak interface position. This suggests that explicitly learning a rule acts like a spotlight. It helps you notice the pattern when you hear it naturally, which then primes your brain to acquire it implicitly later on. Honestly, this is thrilling stuff for cognitive scientists. But it brings up a huge, very practical question. How on earth is an everyday classroom teacher supposed to navigate these heavy debates?
Section 3. The teacher's dilemma. And that question leads us right into the second half of our story today. Because now we're shifting focus from the students trying to learn the language to the graduate educators trying to research how to teach it. See, in the world of applied linguistics, there is this growing and very real disconnect. On one hand, you have highly theoretical, empirical research, these incredibly dense, stat-heavy papers debating the tiniest nuances of those interface positions we just talked about. But on the other hand, you have actual, messy, everyday classroom practice. There's been this widespread shift in academia away from practical, teacher-led problem-solving, moving heavily toward empirical studies that often just completely ignore the reality of being in a classroom. For graduate TEFL students, that's teaching English as a foreign language, who are studying to be the next generation of educators, this gap isn't just annoying, It's honestly kind of terrifying.
To really put a human face on this, let's look at some recent qualitative research focused on master's and PhD TEFL students at state universities in Iran. Keep in mind, these are working teachers. They're actively trying to engage with academic research to get their degrees and become better educators. But the reality they face is pretty stark. One MA student explicitly shared, "Reading articles rich in statistics gives me stress, as I don't understand them well." You see, this isn't about them just being lazy or uninterested. It's a profound, sinking feeling of incompetence and anxiety when they're suddenly walled in by the heavy quantitative mathematics that dominate modern applied linguistics research.
And sadly, it often gets worse when these educators actually try to reach out for help. Another student, who was right in the middle of her dissertation, noted, "I was reading a quantitative article and wanted to ask my professor for help with the statistics, but he did not respond to my email." It really highlights the severe isolation a lot of these graduate students are dealing with. Trying to learn complex pedagogical theory without active mentorship is basically a guaranteed recipe for demotivation. They're being expected to engage with a level of statistical literacy that they've never been properly trained for, and they're being left to figure it out alone. I mean, how are they supposed to succeed in that environment?
Section 4. Statistical anxiety and barriers. Now, what's really interesting about this breakdown is exactly where these teachers are hitting a wall. When surveyed about which specific part of a research article was the absolute hardest to read, well over half, 54.8%, pointed straight at the methodology section of quantitative articles. Another 14.3% flagged the quantitative results section. So if you put that together, nearly 70% of their struggle is entirely wrapped up in interpreting the math, the numbers, and the statistical methods. For a lot of them, it gets so overwhelming they either skip straight to the conclusion or just stop reading entirely. But interestingly enough, they reported almost zero negative feelings when reading qualitative research, which they found way more approachable and actually applicable to their daily teaching.
So what this ultimately reveals are some deeply rooted systemic issues in higher education. The main barriers holding these TEFL students back aren't just a simple lack of statistical knowledge. They are caught up in an intense institutional pressure to publish articles just to get their degrees or move up in their careers. And that publish or perish pressure often totally overshadows their actual desire to make practical scientific contributions to the classroom. Throw in a systemic over-reliance on quantitative research across the whole field, paired with a massive lack of proper methodological training, and you end up with an environment that actively repels teachers from the exact research that was supposedly written to help them.
Section 5. Bridging theory and practice.
Okay, so how do we actually fix this? We need actionable solutions to patch up this disconnect between the academic researchers making the theories and the classroom practitioners dealing with the students. And one of the most vital tools to emerge here is something called action research. Instead of forcing teachers to crunch abstract statistics on massive data sets, action research empowers them to systematically examine their own specific classrooms. It's a really reflective, problem-solving process. A teacher identifies a specific issue right in front of them. Maybe their students are really struggling with speaking fluency. They plan an intervention, act on it, and observe the real-world results. It's a game changer because it perfectly bridges theory and practice, making the research instantly relevant to what the teacher is dealing with every single day.
So, the crucial point is this. We absolutely have to shift the paradigm. We need to foster an environment of teaching-informed research and research-informed teaching. By actually improving mentorship and building accessible research skills, we can transform our educators. They don't have to be stressed out, passive recipients of academic journals anymore. They can become confident, active contributors to the global knowledge base of language teaching.
We've covered some truly incredible ground in this explainer today, haven't we? From the deep cognitive science of implicit and explicit knowledge, all the way to the very real frustrations of graduate students trying to survive the statistical heavy lifting of applied linguistics. And I think it leaves us with a really necessary, maybe even a little provocative, question to reflect on. When we as a society demand that our educators conquer advanced statistics and publish dense empirical papers just to get their teaching degrees, are we actually teaching our teachers how to teach? Or are we really just teaching them how to pass an academic hurdle? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. I really hope this gave you a fresh, powerful perspective on the complex realities going on behind the scenes in language education. Keep asking the big questions and never stop learning.